Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians claim to be preparing for offensives this spring. My big question, Jim, is how is either of them going to have the supplies and the logistics that they need to, since they both seem to have worn out a lot of their stuff? So what's going on right now with resupply and getting ready for these offensives?
Well, the Ukrainians have all that support from the West, and the Russians don't. In fact, Russians have sanctions which limit their ability to generate new capabilities. The Ukrainians always had a supply advantage because they were working on, as the saying goes, interior lines. They had the railroads working. The Russians weren't able to knock the railroads out. The railroad system in Ukraine is, I think it's like 400 some odd stations. It was very well organized. It took some damage early in the war, but they quickly repaired it. So the Russians gave up on that. The Russians, on the other hand, are short in terms of supply because, as has been reported frequently, the Ukrainians use their the HIMARS missiles to regularly blow up Russian supplies. That includes not only a lot of their trucks, they're short on trucks now too, but also whenever the Russian stockpile supplies, Ukrainians, they used to be able, they might still be able to use their cell phones. They just, click a picture of the supply dump, and it goes back to the Ukrainian headquarters, which geolocates where the picture taker was and what he was observing, and bingo, they've got another target. So the Russians are seriously deprived of supplies. They still are, even though they've been dealing with this problem for over a year. The Ukrainians, like I said, they have the interior lines, they have the railroads working. They get a constant flow of new logistical support from the NATO countries. In fact, one thing they've gotten, which is going to be a big help, is they've gotten a lot of mine clearing equipment. I mean, their troops go in there, and some minefields they clear manually, which I remember, learning down in northern Alabama, Huntsville, Arsenal, where we trained my technical detachment. And man, that is a tedious process, and you got to be careful, otherwise you go boom. The Russians are chronically short of supply, and the Ukrainians aren't. And that's going to make a difference. We've already sent them a lot of armored personnel carriers, including Bradleys, and these are being used along how should I put it, cleared routes to advance. So the Russians, no matter what they say about a offensive, they're playing defense, and we saw that recently in Donetsk, where they were trying to take that city, take really in effect by cutting off that city, Volkomar, I believe it was. They would cut a key road route, and they would basically take control of another chunk of Donetsk, which they never took the two provinces that they originally invaded in 2014, and now they're making even less progress. So the Ukrainians are fairly well prepared for their offensive. The Russian offensive is all smoke and mirrors. I mean, the Russians really have no offensive left in them. They are basically going over on the defensive. I mean, actively. They've been redeploying a lot of their forces to dig, anti-tank obstacles, trenches, fortifications, and what have you, because obviously they're not too optimistic about making any progress. Like I say, they've knocked their brains out, lost thousands of troops, trying to take a few small towns in Donetsk and Luhansk, and they've made no progress. So they're in bad shape.
Austin, how do you see it?
Well, almost 98% of the way Jim does, I would point this out, that Russia still has nuclear weapons. They've got tactical and strategic nukes. Whether or not, even if only 50% of them work, that's still several thousand tactical warheads. I throw that in because there's always been some doubt about the reliability of Russian nuclear triggers, which is good in the big story, but all it takes is one nuke to totally rearrange, at least politically, not totally rearrange. Russia already faces tons of opposition from Europe, but Europe would go bonkers if Russia pulled off a nuke. But they do have that, and that is an offensive weapon. And I'm just bringing that up to that one that Ukraine can't militarily counter. Russia still has, and I know I read some things Jim's written. I read in the defense publications that there's a lot of evidence that Russia's running out of its missile stocks, and I'm talking about short-range, medium-range missiles and aircraft-delivered missiles, which doesn't surprise me given the attempted destruction of Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian infrastructure. And of course, they've done some substitution with Iranian so-called kamikaze drones. But they still haven't broken Ukraine's will. We can mark that up as another example of failure of a strategic air war to break the will of break national resistance. The only possible really example of that happening is the U.S. dropping 2 atomic weapons on Japan. But Douai's idea that you're going to bomb every your enemies into submission with strategic bombing just hasn't panned out, and Russia's tried to do it somewhat in miniature using missiles because they found out that they couldn't gain air superiority. But it's about air parity is what it amounts to in a very interesting situation. But that leads to what the bigger points that Jim made, which is that Russia really does look like it's on the defensive. I think the name of that little town, I mean, it is nowhere down Bakhmut, is the way I've heard pronounce it. If I say this, I'm not a Ukrainian officer. I wouldn't have bothered defending it. I would have pulled back 2 or 3, 4 clicks. And if the Russians just have to get in there and then just smash them with artillery fire, HIMARS, and whatever. But they decided that since Russia had made a big deal out of it, I say they, the Ukrainian high command said, we'll make a big deal out of it. And what they did was turn it into a meat grinder for Russians. They've lost a substantial number of soldiers there, but the kill rate, I don't know what it is precisely. I think the Ukrainians have a pretty good feel for it. You can't believe anything the Russians say, but it's at least 2 to 1, if not 3 to 1. In other words, the Russians, whatever they were going to do with an offensive, they've wrecked their infantry trying to take a place that really doesn't have any operational significance. Might have some immediate tactical if you're looking at supplying areas within 5-6 kilometers from there. I saw an analysis that suggested, well, that Bakhmut has roads. Well, it doesn't have those roads anymore because it looks like a World War I wasteland, and is. So what the Russians did was shoot themselves by trying to take this town, and the Ukrainians accommodated them. There goes their offensive. The other thing is that they brought in and they made a big deal out of this, Dan, I want to say in December, either November or December, of bringing in a bunch of old T-62s that were going to be refurbished and you had various numbers showing up, anywhere from 600 to 1,000 T-62s. They were going to bring in T-62s from, which was the Russian main battle tank of 1975 when I was in an M60A1. It shows you the era there, and ERA, but that's the era of the T-62, and refurbished them. I'm not sure that is, even if they do that, if that is something that gives them an offensive edge. Might be very useful in a defense, which gets back to what Jim said about evidence that the Russians are preparing for a defensive battle, certainly in the Crimea. There have been several articles out about Russian trench digging systems, and I've even seen some satellite photos of Russian trenches south of Kherson and rolling across to the east, designed to defend the Crimean Peninsula, and also part of the area southeast of Kherson that they've seized. So they anticipate the Russians, at least on the ground, are signaling they anticipate a Ukrainian significant Ukrainian counteroffensive. Ukraine has made the artillery munitions and include HIMARS, rockets in that. They were counteroffensives. Might be best to call them tactical counteroffensives. There's little strikes they made beginning last summer and through the fall, which pushed the Russians back to really to the way the lines are there. They showed that they could fight a combined arms battle. And I wrote a piece about this. We had a strategy talk where both Jim and I got into how the Ukrainians had demonstrated in battle that they can handle combined arms, where you get a synergistic effect of infantry, armored infantry, tanks, artillery, air, drones, not so much to close air support in the classic sense from a manned aircraft, but their ability to employ drones to provide air support, which I think is going to be interesting to see what they do if they really launch a major operational counteroffensive. I'm not sure what the situation is right now with their new Western main battle tanks. I would be surprised if we saw more than 24 on the battlefield. I think the Ukrainians would use them as a media opportunity. But it takes a while to learn how to fight a Leopard 2A7, basically, is what the Germans have sent them, or a Leopard 2A5. It takes a long time to learn how to fight an M1A2. I mean, I'm talking about the crew learning how to use it. The British sent them, I think, 14 Challengers. They're superior tanks. Yet tanks don't fight individually. I've said that before. You've got to have them covered by armored infantry, and also you give them air cover so they're not being hit by enemy airstrike. So I don't see within the next 5 to 6 months a huge push from modern Western tanks. May see action from the modernized T-72s and the other ex-Soviet tanks that the Ukrainians have been refurbishing, or they've been cascaded from NATO countries, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles. They're not the only ones, but that have passed them to them, and the Ukrainians know how to use them. Where do I think they'll strike? I know you didn't ask me that Dan. Seeing that the Russians have set up Crimea to look like something like what they were doing when they were building their anti-tank defenses in preparation of Kursk. I don't think they're going to go at Crimea, but I think they're going to try to do something that really punctures the Russian lines, maybe penetrates right to the Russian border and separates Donetsk and Luhansk. That would have a political, send a political message. It'd show up on television screens, media screens all over the world, and then show that they punched a hole in the Russian occupied territory. Can they do it? That remains to be seen. But if they are fully supplied, particularly with artillery munitions, have sufficient air cover, and demonstrate the tactical agility that they already have in those counteroffensives, I think that's what we'd see.
Jim, how is Russia going to continue to respond to this? Because they don't really have the munitions anymore to give their troops to even keep fighting, right?
Well, they don't have the troops either. They're basically, their forces in Ukraine are comprised primarily of conscripts. People do not want to be there, whereas the Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland. So there's a huge difference in the quality of the forces opposing each other. The other problem is that if and when the Ukrainians do get their Leopards and their M1s into action, and they are, and the Challengers, they do train pretty quickly. I saw some reports and a video of the Ukrainians, training on the Challenger. They sent them to England to do this, and they apparently adapted pretty quickly. I mean, basically, they're taking Ukrainian tank crews who were previously using the Russian tanks and sending them in to train on the Western tanks. Now, the Ukrainians quickly found out that these Western tanks are much more capable. And this has been demonstrated in many other wars where Western tanks faced, Russian-made tanks. The Russian tanks don't have the firepower. They don't have the protection. They have mobility, but that doesn't do you much good because the Western tanks have better fire control and they can hit moving targets on the move while they're moving with great accuracy. And the Ukrainians were impressed by that. So like I say, they picked up on the Challenger. In fact, what they needed more than anything else was time in the tank. Just learning exactly what it could do. Learning how to operate the tank was not that difficult. The M1s and the Leopards, as far as maintenance goes, they have plenty of maintenance personnel. And like I say, the Ukrainians have every incentive to do it fast and do it right. And they're well aware of this. The Russians, on the other hand, the people they have in Ukraine don't want to be there. And the Russians are having a more and more difficult time, rounding up people to send down there. And the ones that do go down there have poor training, poor leadership, poor supplies. Like I say, the Ukrainians can consistently hammer at Russian supplies because they have a UAV, a drone system that does the artillery spotting or target spotting, and then they can send in HIMARS or artillery. There's not much manned aircraft. This is something you got to take careful note of. Manned aircraft haven't been used too much. They're too vulnerable. In other words, the Ukrainians are getting Patriot missiles now too, but even with the ones they've got, it's a very lethal playground for Russian manned aircraft. In fact, what they tend to do is they fire weapons from inside Russia, which affords them some protection. But recently, I think just the other day, one of these Russian aircraft, making a bombing run, as it were, had a accident, and it released the bomb over a Russian city and killed several people and destroyed a lot of property. So, the Russians haven't really got their heart in it, as it were, whereas the Ukrainians do, and don't underestimate that. The Ukrainians basically make the most of any new weapons they get. The Russians don't have anything to match it. For example, the Russians ran through those T-62s very quickly. They weren't too successful, and now they've been sending in T-55s. Now, they still have some of those, couple of thousand. They used them for training. So they had some, runners, as they say. But these turkeys didn't have much ammunition. They just used them to train crews before they switched over to a modern tank like the T-90 or the T-72. But these tanks are nothing to write home about. So the Russians are at a huge disadvantage, and they know it. They're basically playing defense. As Austin pointed out, they've been digging trenches, and digging in wherever they can. Because what they are afraid the Ukrainians are going to do initially is not, as Austin points out, go for Ukraine, which is a peninsula. It's, there's a narrow isthmus and what have you, surrounded by these swamps, as it were, of very impassable terrain, which makes it difficult to get in there. But what the Ukrainians are going to do is basically chase them out of the other territory the Russians occupy. And in doing this, they cut off supplies to Crimea. Crimea, it's dangerous for Russian ships to operate. Well, they can't send in enough ships to supply Crimea. And the only access route they have is via a Mariupol, a city that the Russians have and have a rail line going and getting into Crimea. Now, if the Ukrainians knock that out, and that is well within their capabilities of taking that, bingo, Crimea is, no food, no ammunition, no nothing. And that's what the Russians fear the most, because as far as they're concerned, the Ukrainians could easily do that. And so we'll see. I think the Ukrainians will take the prudent approach. They'll knock out the supply route to Crimea, and then they'll wait a bit and go in there and face a demoralized, garrison and population. Civilians have been leaving Crimea. Now, the Russians have made that illegal recently because so many of the civilians were getting out. They knew what was coming. But the Russians haven't had too much success in getting people to stay. Like I say, the Russians have their corruption, which has always been the bane of their military operations, and a lack of morale. Again, they can't get troops willing to fight. There are very few regulars left. That battle we talked about, Bakhmut, that basically wiped out the last of the regulars. They had some airborne divisions down there. In fact, they put an airborne commander, general, in charge of all the forces in Ukraine now, because his guys were the only ones who had any, how should I put it, effectiveness. But most of them died. In fact, some of the airborne, brigades that they talk about are basically don't have regulars anymore. I mean, they basically ran through all their original complement, and they're just filled with untrained, unqualified conscripts who are basically more of a liability than an asset when the Ukrainians come storming in. So, supply-wise, the Russians are in trouble. Troop-wise, the Russians are in trouble. And equipment-wise, the Russians are in trouble. I mean, my God, they're bringing in T-55s. And they don't even have ammunition. Well, much ammunition for these things. They use a 100-millimeter gun, and they never use them for gunnery practice. And so they have elderly stocks of, 100-millimeter shells for the tanks. So they're basically got unarmed tanks, which they can send in there to, provide target practice for the Ukrainians.
Austin,
let me add something when I was talking.
Okay.
Sure.
Go ahead.
When I was mentioning the T-62s, one of the concerns about it, at least, the analysis of the Russians using them, is the 115-millimeter guns on the T-62s have the same ammunition problem that Jim says about the 100 millimeters on the T-55s. The ammo was old, and the main how the T-62s that they were bringing in were having to be almost entirely refit because they'd been rotting and rusting in tank yards back in central Russia. So that's when I brought that up, even though it was now 4, 5, 6 months ago they were bringing them. They've got a lot of refurbishment on those older tanks. Let me point out something though about the modern Western main battle tanks. There aren't that many of them. The Brits gave them 14 Challengers. Challenger's a very superior tank. It may be the best armored of the Leopard, Abrams, and Challenge. The Leopard is the one. The Leopard 2 is the one I think the Ukrainians should have gotten because it has diesel engines. The M1 has a turbine. Now it's like a Corvette that weighs somewhere between 65 and 70 tons, depending on how you fit it out, because it can really go fast, easily break 40 miles an hour if you take the governor off of it. I've had stories by M1, it was M1A1 tank crews saying, "Sir, you don't know how fast we can get going." They wink and say they break 50 miles an hour. Well, I don't know what they were doing. Probably in the desert. Much harder to do in Ukraine, but they're very, very fast. Of course, they're burning fuel quickly when they're going that fast, and they're only doing that showing off. But you don't have that many. I think the total numbers, once they're deployed, is about 80. So the Ukrainians, their tank force is still going to be relying on T-72, modernized T-72s is what I would guess, unless Jim knows something on that that I don't. But the thing that's for them is the attrition of Russian logistics, the Russian supply, and then the effect that they know how to tactically fight a combined arms offensive, and that gives them an edge. One of a huge edge. The other thing about Bakhmut, I remember looking at a force laydown in a British newspaper. I want to say, let's see, it's April now. This would have been January when Russia was saying that they were going to take Bakhmut. And on the Ukrainians' left flank, if I recall correctly, so the Naval Infantry Brigade and this air assault unit, and there was Wagner, and over on the right was some sort of motorized infantry unit. And the article that was with it was that, and Jim, you may remember this, I think we discussed it briefly, that this regarded as elite naval infantry unit from actually the Siberia, had suffered over 50% dead, whatever the entire casualty rate, and including losing 300 men and one HIMARS strike. And that's those, even if these are not, even if they're just good estimates, that shows you the level of casualties the Russians were taking just to try to knock the Ukrainians out of a really relatively useless, now pockmarked, cratered small town in eastern Ukraine. Can you call it a Ukrainian victory? Probably, because of what the Russians decided to go ahead and do to try to achieve, as far as they were after, a propaganda victory. So that falls on, actually not on the military command, but on the Kremlin. The Kremlin was one pushing it. We've got to have some sort of media victory. And they didn't get it.
It was a propaganda victory for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and ultimately it is.
And once we get, Western tanks versus Russian tanks, you'll see another, a replay of, battles in the Middle East where you had Western tanks versus, Russian tanks. And even, in the Middle East, often you had, Iraqi crews in the M1s. We gave them a bunch of M1s. And even then they were superior. The only thing you had to worry about was morale. The minute the Iraqi crews sense, that they might be in a little danger, they'd bail out. And I think that was with with ISIL. And terrorists captured several of these things intact. They couldn't do much. They ran up for a bit, and then they ran out of, they couldn't maintain them and what have you. So that was a propaganda victory for them. But the Ukrainians are a lot more together, as it were, in terms of maintenance, in terms of operating these tanks. And if you get a battle with maybe only a couple of dozen or 30 or 40, Western tanks, against the Russians, it's going to be embarrassing for the Russians because they really have no real defense.
You may be you make, but in my assessment of how I would use that limited number of tanks on Yarfley in a situation where it would be decisive, and that's probably what the Ukrainians will do. That's probably what have them supported by their best mechanized infantry, and in a spot where they want to break through. And as when it first started, I said I could see this on the map. They go through and someplace where they fight the Russian occupied territory. Ideally, Mariupol would be a target, but I think that's tougher to get to than some of the. And what you want to do is find a soft spot, have a breakthrough, and then let your mobile troops run wild in the enemy's rear. So possibly,
well, that's what they do going after Mariupol. That is a vital logistics target, for the Russians, and it's very vulnerable. Like I said, Crimea, getting into the Crimea, of course, that small isthmus is doable, but it's difficult.
Mariupol, though, is on the Sea of Azov, and it's also if you look at how long it took the Russians to reduce Mariupol because of the area is pretty. It's a strong defensive position if you've got troops who are willing to fight. I'll specify that. It can be a strong defensive position, but going for Mariupol would be a good target.
Indeed, and the Ukrainians don't have to take it. All they have to do is neutralize it as a supply line, and that is far more achievable. And that's what the Ukrainians would probably want to do. They play a smarter game, so to speak, than the Russians do, and that's been their advantage all along.
Well, we'll continue to watch all of this and report on what we see and interpret it and let people know what we're thinking. So we'll talk to you next time.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye, guys.